Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the table. We discuss issues of God and culture. Our topic today is the church in the midst of pandemic, and we're going to take a global perspective on this topic. So I have three guests from three very different parts of the world. Neil Tai is in the Philippines, and welcome, Neil, to the table.
Hello, Dr. Bock, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting us.
Glad to do it. And Michael Van Andel is in South Africa. Welcome, Michael.
Afternoon, Dr. Bock.
Yeah,
nice to be here.
Exactly right. It's afternoon where you are, it's morning where I am, and it's evening where they are. And then Timothy Muthyala, who's in India. Welcome, Timothy.
Thank you, Dr. Bock, and wonderful to be here.
Glad to be with you. And so let's get specific in terms of locations. I've said Philippines, South Africa, and India. Where specifically in your country are you residing, Neil?
Currently, I'm residing in Quezon City, which is just, it's part of the Metro Manila complex, and the city is just beside Manila proper.
Okay, and how much of a population does Manila have? How big a city is it?
Metro Manila is composed of about maybe 15 to almost 20 million in population, not counting the streetcars and sidecars and bicycles that are roaming the streets nowadays. About 40 million together.
Manila's traffic is legendary, so great. And Michael, where are you located?
I am based in Sandton, South Africa, which is part of the broader Johannesburg area. And I was getting really nervous when you asked Neil about the population of Manila, because it is very difficult to estimate the population of Johannesburg. And even with good estimates, I may not be the person to ask for an exact count.
Well, more or less. Do you have any idea what kind of the range is, or what is it in the It's about 1 million or so, or is it bigger than that?
It's way, way bigger than that. Part of the reason it's difficult to estimate is that it just depends where you draw the lines in terms of township areas, which are, I suppose, similar to almost ghetto cities in the US in some ways, and very densely populated and sprawling. So it really depends how you measure Johannesburg.
But a few million.
Multiple millions.
Multiple millions, okay. And then, Timothy, where are you in India?
I am from the South India, southern part. I come from a state called Telangana, which has around 40 million people. But I live in the capital city, which is called as Hyderabad, which has around 7 million people.
Yeah, I've been there. It's an interesting, fascinating place. By the way, I just recently acquired an India cricket jersey, Timothy, so I just want you to know that I'm keeping up my cricket interests. So, well, great. So let me dive in. So you're all in major metropolitan areas, and obviously the church has been significantly impacted by the pandemic. I think I want to ask two questions to start off with, and that is, how long have you not been meeting for, if you're still not meeting, and or if you've opened up, how recently have you opened up, and what's been the impact of the pandemic on the church in at least in your region? I'd be hard to speak for the country as a whole, but if to the extent that you want to reflect on that. And I'm going to go in reverse order. So I'm going to start with India, because India has been in the news in the last several months for the severity of the pandemic. And where do things stand right now, Timothy, and what's the situation with the church?
Wow. As the world might know, we are actually anticipating the third wave of COVID. During the first wave, we almost lost around 3 to 4 months of church gatherings because of the strict lockdown was in place for almost over a month, I think, if my memory serves me well. But after that, during the second wave again, we had another 2 months of break from the church, uh, uh, which was totally strange for Indian setup because we were not prepared in other ways, especially during the first wave. The impact was great, uh, and most of the churches did not have any clue as to how they would switch, and they developed a lot of a discussion whether we can use the internet-based churches, or whether some people thought that we have to gather at any cost. So they were trying to gather even during the pandemic because they felt uh, probably it's a uh, it's a challenge for religiosity, so we should stand up for the challenge, kind of thinking among some. But that's a minority, I would say. Yeah, it was the strangest situation, and we were in lockdown for a long time, and for many weeks we couldn't gather as church. After the second wave, we started to gather only since last 3 weeks.
And so, but you're anticipating the possibility that you might have to lock down again, right?
Yes, second or third weeks of August is when people are expecting the spike for the third time.
Wow.
Then
go ahead. I'm sorry.
We're not sure. I was just going to say, but we are not sure whether they would impose a lockdown like they were doing it earlier, but there might be some restrictions on travel and things like that. We are not sure if they would opt for complete lockdown.
And of course, one of the challenges in India is, I assume, that vaccination process is barely underway, or at least has not impacted that many people.
Yes. According to the government stats, around 20% people have got at least the first shot of vaccines. But it's still very low with the kind of number that we have. So vaccine preventing the third wave, it may not be possible because not many people are vaccinated right now.
Right. Yeah.
But it is underway. It is underway.
And of course, for those of you who aren't aware, India is a vast country with a significant population. I understand it's over 1 billion now, just in the country itself. Yeah, 1.3.
1.3 billion.
Almost as large as China, or have you passed China? It's close, I know.
It's close. We haven't passed.
Yeah. So anyway, significant. Well, let's turn to South Africa. Michael, what's the situation there, and kind of what's the overview of what the pandemic has been like and the impact on the churches?
Well, we are presently in the midst of a third wave with the Delta variant, and churches are once again closed. Interprovincial travel isn't allowed, with certain caveats, certain types of business travel and whatnot, but no leisure travel and so forth. We have had various different lockdowns beginning from about March or April last year. So at times it hasn't been possible for churches to meet at all. At other times, attendance has been limited to 50 or 100 people. And at one stage, maybe 50% of venue sizes. So there's really been ebbs and flows, but church meeting still hasn't gone back to normal. As I said, not meeting at all at the moment. And when people do meet, it's required that you wear masks and apply social distancing. So I'd say it's been quite tough for people to connect, especially in larger congregations, firstly. And secondly, I mentioned the township areas. So there are a lot of churches in those kind of areas that simply don't have resources in terms of bandwidth to actually meet electronically. And in fact, it's virtually impossible to socially distance in some of those areas, and people are reliant on community interactions. So there's really been different challenges depending on whether you're in a more affluent area or in less affluent areas, and just depending on how high infections are in that particular area. But things have definitely not gone back to normal. And Darrell, as I mentioned to you, we've had a lot of generalized anarchy and looting in South Africa in the past week or so, and that's added to the complexity of the crisis.
And now to the Philippines, Neil. Well, wait, let me ask Michael one other question. And where's the status of vaccinations in the country, Michael? I'd
say probably between 7 and 8% of people have received at least one dose now. I actually received my first vaccination dose yesterday after waiting in a line for 5 hours. In terms of people who have received first and second vaccinations, that's probably about 2.5%. I hope that's right, but I think
so. Not very much vaccination yet. I'm curious, which vaccine did you get? Do you know?
I received the Pfizer vaccine.
Okay, so we're Pfizer brothers. And Neil, a situation in the Philippines and the status of vaccination in the country.
Since March of 2020. Kids are not allowed below 16 years old, and 65 years above, they're not allowed and to go out of their premises because of this pandemic. And the government has imposed a lot of restrictions, so which has affected a lot of church meetings and gatherings. Recently, the cases have been coming down here in the Philippines, and so government has started to open up. And just a week ago, the government just allowed kids from 5 years above to leave their premises to go anywhere they like. But of course, it's just outdoors. For malls, they're not allowed to go in. Much more in churches. If it's indoors, kids are not allowed. So this has affected a lot of families from going to church. Recently, the government allows about 30% of capacity for churches to gather. So there's still a lot of churches that don't meet because people are generally scared of getting infected over here. So since March 2020 until now, it's like many people haven't gone to church physically here in the Philippines.
Now, obviously, for all of you, part of the issue here is if you shut down a church and can't meet in a building, then the question becomes, what is the alternative? And so I want to walk through that. And of course, obviously the alternative, the primary alternative that at least exists in the United States is to meet digitally through Zoom or its equivalent. And that assumes a pretty extensive digital capability. So I'd like to walk through kind of the situation in each of your countries from that standpoint. And Neil, I'll start with you in the Philippines. I'm just imagine that except in maybe significant metro areas, this might be a little bit of a challenge because you not only have the availability of the digital means, but the way in which internet works in each of the countries where you pay for the amount of data that you use, and using Zoom or something like that because it's often video, et cetera, is expensive for people. Is that correct?
That's very true. For a country that survives or lives by about $10 a day, for the normal folks here, it is tough for them to add on to their data plan. So it's a big challenge for the poor people to be able to gain access into this online churches. Generally, almost all churches here have gone online. And I've spoken to some of my friends. They said that, in the outskirts, especially those with no internet access, they have not gone to church since the lockdown last year, 2020. So many people have not gone to church in general.
So
it's a
highly disruptive.
Highly disrupted. That's true.
Yeah, interesting. South Africa, Michael, what's the situation there when it comes to access and the expense of doing so for people? And obviously this depends on whether you're in the cities or in the townships. And when we talk about townships, we just might describe a little bit about what's involved in a township area. Michael?
Sure. So in terms of the first part of what you said, it really does depend on area and levels of affluence. We have, I'd say, limited examples of free public Wi-Fi. So a lot of people are on pay-as-you-go data plans. For more affluent churches, there has been the possibility of moving to Zoom or other equivalent communication platform. I think one interesting challenge that has come up for various congregations is that a lot of large congregations here are really dependent on hype and having a certain type of a musical band experience and getting an atmosphere together, which does not necessarily translate well into a Zoom type of platform. So I think maybe in the medium term, that is something good, in that people in leadership might be challenged to think about what their priorities ought to be in terms of ministry. On the flip side, I think a lot of people who maybe were on the outskirts of attending a local congregation and maybe sporadic and that kind of thing, it's been pretty easy for them just to disengage and drop off from regular attendance. In the township areas, which you asked me to describe, often these, or almost always, these are areas that are a remnant of the apartheid era where non-white populations primarily were aggregated according to racial classifications, often in very densely populated areas. But there are different racial groupings, and so townships would sometimes take on the characteristic of that particular language grouping, cultural grouping, and so forth. But also a lot of people don't have permanent homes. So there's a lot of informal dwellings in various places like that, which is not dissimilar to what you have in India and the Philippines. When we come to township areas, I'd say things like Zoom and video connections are simply impossible in many instances, both because of the nature of devices, but also the fact that, as Neil was saying, in the Philippines, it just would add too much cost, and we don't always have the fastest internet access. So in those kind of areas, some of the congregations are doing things like WhatsApp voice messages coupled with sending certain sermon notes via WhatsApp grouping or Telegram or something like that. So people are trying to continue with the work of serving the Lord and ministering to people. But there are many practical needs as well in township areas that simply can't be met via internet platforms. And because of the densely populated nature of the area, as I said earlier, sometimes, let alone social distancing, sometimes there isn't running water. So it's all well and good to tell people to be careful and to wash hands and those kinds of things. But we really live in a country where there are marked contrasts between those who have reasonable employment and certain people who just struggle to get by.
Yeah, I just remember on some of the drives that we've taken through South Africa, going by the townships or in some cases into them, the amount of what I'll just call independent wiring that goes on that connects some of the homes. Corrugated steel is oftentimes, what a wall of a home would be, that kind of thing. And so the disruption, we've talked about disruption in general, but the disruption, particularly in the poorer areas, is really intense. And the ability to actually have a functional church is really challenging. We've had, of course, Neil, who we know, Henry, we've had as a guest talking about ministry in the townships. At some point, I'd love to get him on the table and talk about the particular challenge of ministry in the townships. But again, the bottom line is the same as with Neil, highly disruptive. And I agree with you totally, Michael, that the one thing that doesn't translate very well in an internet environment, in a Zoom environment for a church, is the worship and the music, and the way in which the music and the worship as kind of a group exercise gets experienced in a church building. You just can't replicate that very straightforwardly in a Zoom environment. That's, I think, one of the challenges people have. Go ahead.
One last observation which just occurred to me whilst you were summarizing is that I'd say a lot of the people in township areas are those who are more reliant on day labor types of jobs. For example, working in the hospitality industry or working as cleaners. And as companies scale back and people are not using office space and others are really reluctant to travel or aren't allowed by law to travel at certain times, those are also generally the people who are affected the most. So the type of ministry that already was taking place, where people were quite dependent on the community and so forth, that has only been amplified because of the crisis, and further by some of the looting and rioting and anarchy that's taken place in the last week.
Yeah. Of course, you've had the political disruption of having a former president be convicted of corruption, and so that's impacted the environment there as well. Let's talk about India, Timothy. What we've heard two stories. I wonder how similar or dissimilar it is from what we've been describing.
Yeah, I think it is quite similar to what's happening in the other parts of the world. Even here, we had difficulty with, especially with technology and phones that would hold such a technology like Zoom, and usually younger generation is more prone to use smartphones, which can hold apps like Zoom. And most of the other folks did not have the privilege of such gadgets. So that was one issue that we faced. And we, in my observation, randomly, I think there was only 30 to 40% of people of the total congregation were actually able to attend some form of online service. We had Zoom services, but also we recorded that and posted it on YouTube for people to access at a different time. But the length of the service was also an issue because people had only limited data on their phones. I think usually it was holding up to 45 minutes or so, but sometimes our services are long, and there was this problem. And the Wi-Fi connectivity and other things are also so poor. So I remember instances where I was preaching and I had to stop because power was gone or internet was gone for some time. So this definitely disrupts the mood of worship, and already we have a lot of limitations, but through internet and lack of use of technology, proper technology, I think it added to the problem. And purchasing data is expensive here. Not everybody would want to have data always on their phones. And now, with children also turning towards online education, that started to compete with data. So people wanted more data on their phones or on other gadgets. And so that was something that we saw. More younger people were ready for such services, and almost 60% of our congregation was without church. They did not attend any form of service during that lockdown, and they whenever there was an opportunity, they were longing to get back to church and get back to fellowship. So we felt very bad because we are unable to reach these folks who always were used to go to church, and they uh, for them it is a very meaningful moment of the week. So they are unable to have that, and people expressed their desire to come back to the church, and they said we really want to be in the church and want to worship the Lord and give thanks to the Lord for, especially after the recovered from COVID. They longed for fellowship, and they longed to share testimonies, and uh, so that, but we had to wait for a long time for that to happen. uh, uh, Moving forward, if there is another wave and multiple waves coming uh, ahead, then we have to see how we can actually work with this situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real challenge. I'm thinking about, here, obviously in the States, most everyone is connected. Most people, or many people, have plans where they're not paying for the size of data. They're just renting from month to month, and they just slow you down if you go over your limit, that kind of thing. So it's a very different digital environment here. And you can stay connected, and people were meeting weekly, and now the challenge for the American church is you've got people who've gotten used to meeting in church online, and getting them back into the services now that they've opened up has become the challenge for some people, because a lot of people like attending church, on kind of on their own schedule. So we've got that. We're facing that problem, but it sounds like what we're dealing with in most of these other countries is not that situation. And I suspect that a lot of churches are having to think through what the situation is going to be like on the other side, with so many people disconnected for so long to church. What does that mean? So how are church leaders thinking about that particular challenge? The idea of, when we do open up, what's going to happen in terms of how many people have we lost because they've been disconnected for so long? Timothy, what's the what is the anticipation of that situation in India?
Wow. There is one unique problem that we faced, especially in our city, was migration because of the COVID situation. Many people wanted to go back to their native places from the cities to which they migrated for work. So, and that's one way that people have moved away from the city itself. So, congregation is affected through that. And people got it looks like some folks, like in US, are used to online platform, and they are more comfortable there, and they want to stay there, uh, at least with the fear that another wave might come in, so they just want to stay away from the church. But most of the congregation is still anticipating and looking forward for physical gatherings, and they just want to come. They just want to have that experience in the group. So they are looking forward to it. That's what we've been noticing. Not very sure how church would look like if the situation continues to recur. So far, we're always thinking about the getting back to normal. But if this becomes the new normal, then how are we going to tackle it is definitely a challenge for Indian church, I would say.
South Africa, Michael?
It's a good question. I think, as I was saying earlier about people who are more on the outskirts of church attendance, I think devoted followers of Christ have continued to look for ways to engage. But in some instances, some of the congregations will just have a different mix of people who actually come back after all this time off. There are people who have been reaching out to local churches and to other ministries like the one I'm involved in, and they may start going to church for the first time at the end of this pandemic. But I do think that the composition of congregations will be somewhat different, at least to what it's been. I also think in a South African context, it's somewhat unclear how reopening plans will progress. In other words, as the vaccine rollout continues, might it be a situation where churches reopen to 25% and then 50% and so forth? In some ways, mega church type of congregations have more restrictions on being able to meet for longer than some of the smaller congregations who can satisfy quantity specifications, attendee specifications by government. I think finally, in terms of what you were saying about people, that the musical expression part of worship services, perhaps some people are starting to think more holistically about worshiping God, including ministry of the word, how they live, interactions with others, with congregational musical expression being a part of that, but not being equivalent to worship, such that music equals worship, that worship embraces all of life and is core to what it is in terms of being a Christian. And if we have not been able to meet and have the same corporate singing experience, that's something people are longing for. And they're also longing for interaction with others, where, even speaking for myself, even where I've been able to attend church gatherings, it's not the same when people are nervous and often looking to disperse more rapidly, wearing masks. It's harder to recognize people. So I think people, especially singles, elderly people, are missing a lot of those social interactions, particularly in a church context, but more broadly in a societal context. So that loneliness issue is a very real one. And exactly how that all gets worked out when some people are vaccinated and others aren't, and there's still a general suspicion, that is a little unclear.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned early on that Timothy and Neil teach in their respective countries, and in some cases pastor, and then Michael is connected with an organization called Truth Walk, which is a parachurch organization that encourages Bible studies in businesses and arranges conferences for Bible studies for churches in South Africa. In fact, I'm in the midst of a multi-week session with them, Zooming from the United States on the Book of Acts. So different ministries, but a wide array of experiences. Neil, so the challenge for the churches that you said they haven't really been meeting since March of 2020. So this is, well over a year now. What's the impact in terms of what churches are either expecting on the other end or what they're seeing now?
Yes, the hard part is I spoke to a friend of mine who is a local pastor, and he mentioned to me that several pastors struggle as well because of this pandemic, because no church is meeting up, their finances are suffering, so they have to leave the ministry to look for another job. So the question here is, if the church goes back to normal, how many pastors do we still have here in the Philippines who can serve on this capacity. And serving the Philippines as a pastor is like almost like making a vow to poverty. So it's a tough job here. And the second thing I've noticed is home churches have sprouted up. I think families have realized that since we cannot go out, we can come together for a season. I live with my parents together with my family, and many families here are multi-families are staying together in homes. And so in some sense, before the pandemic, Christians go to church, non-Christians stay home. But because Christians are now staying home, and they invite their perhaps Christian family members and even non-Christian family members to join worship. So this has become a wonderful ministry that the early church started in homes, and I think this is becoming a wonderful ministry for Christians to penetrate the gospel through their homes. And I think the church was not ready for home churches or for head of families to lead their family for Christ. So I think this is something that the church need to be aware of, moving away from physical to home church and raising up the head of the families to shepherd their families for Christ.
Interesting. One last question, go around and we'll this will be the wrap up. I'm interested to see what do you. I want you to put on your prediction hat. Okay, I won't turn you into a prophet. I won't give you that much promotion, but put on your ability to predict. And what do you think will be the challenges if and when we come out of the pandemic? In other words, what will churches face? Neil, you've already alluded to one of them, and that is how many pastors are actually going to be left who are going to be prepared to pastor. What other challenge do you see for the church there in the Philippines as the turnaround happens?
And I think for the community or the non-Christian world out there, how many would want to come to church as well? Because it's like we are in this major scare worldwide. Everybody's scared to go out or even to meet with people or mingle with people. And so it's like before you could just go out in the streets and share the gospel. So people are now afraid of mingling with other people because of social distancing. So I think that the major challenge is how do we reach the non-Christian world out there with the gospel? You can't even get into their homes. You can't even meet them. So how do we utilize this social technology to reach them? To bring the gospel to them, and that's another challenge. Perhaps churches need to find ways to other ways to connect with the social realm around them, with the community around them. And recently, there has been a movement socially here in the country for public or community pantry, because the government is not able to provide enough funds for people in lockdown. So the communities themselves arrange themselves in such a way that you could donate some food or some food items, and people can line up and get some food item out of it. And so one of my friends, he decided to talk to the local town folks to say that can we volunteer ourselves to help out and even talk to people about Christ. And because generally Filipinos are very religious, so they allowed these Christians to come and talk to them while they line up to get their community pantry. So I think that's another way that the church can do, is to mingle with society and to meet people where they are and to help meet their needs as well.
Michael, South Africa, what do you put on your prognostication cap, and where do you think things are going? Or what are the challenges?
Well, you mentioned Truth Walk, and you know that we're a discipleship ministry, so we work with scholars like yourself. We work with Bible literacy initiatives amongst business people, and that's continued via Zoom because people have access to Zoom. And then the third aspect of Truth Walk is trying to work with colleges and people serving township communities and connecting them with discerning, discipled business people who can help to mobilize resources, whether it be books, financial, and so forth. I think that in some areas, it possibly isn't desirable to go back to what was the status quo before, because I think a lot of churches have not taken the discipleship mandate as seriously as they ought to have done. Perhaps Bible reading, Bible exposition has not been as prevalent in making and maturing disciples as it ought to have been. So I would hope that at least in more solid congregations and churches that have seen that their people are really longing for substantive answers, interactions, the biblical theological equipment to process some of these things, to grieve and not just have faith that everything is going to be hunky-dory all the time and that the gospel is a road to riches or whatever else it may be. Hopefully there will be some long-term positive impact from that. I think South Africa, well, I know South Africa for a long time has struggled with having an insufficient number of trained pastoral leaders, whether that's formal theological training or more informal type of training. That situation was already problematic here before COVID. We continue to work to try and play our little part in that. I think that it will take time to see church buildings, particularly in more suburban areas, back to the capacity crowds that they may have been used to. I think there will be an overhang in terms of less budgetary resources being available to some of these congregations. Probably like Neil was saying, I think in some instances people will realize that it's not so much about the building, which at present is largely being unused, but it's about community and people. And a large part of what people are missing are those passing interactions that take place in the midst of all the other elements of a corporate church service. So I think people will be eager for deeper interactions once those are possible, but it will take time, possibly quite a long time in an emerging market environment like ours, where you will have a situation where some are vaccinated, some are not, and people continue to be nervous. And there probably will be a stage where questions will have to be wrestled with about what level of risk is permissible in the midst of loving others and being available to others. And to what extent do you cloister away because you're scared of a resurfacing of the virus or some infection once you've already been vaccinated. So I think we're going to be in this for a lot longer than the US and Europe and other places like that. And I'm guessing the same is true for India and the Philippines.
Timothy, India, what do you put on your prognostication cap? What do you think the other side of the pandemic looks like and the challenges that are associated with it?
Yeah, one thing would be sure, that is, we cannot undo the online explosion that is happening. So we may need to think long term with respect to the online facilities also. With respect to offline, probably this pandemic has given an opportunity to reach out to new groups of people, like Brother Neil was saying. It gave opportunity to take the church into the homes of people. And usually in Indian setup, there would be one or two people attending the church, and most of them would not be coming, or they are not believers. So in such setups, I feel this disruption has actually worked out for good, so that people who are feeling the stigma to come to church can actually access the church without going to the church physically. So that way, I think it is positive. The aspect of house churches and some form of uh, devotions happening at home is something new that we are seeing. Every home has some prayer time happening. And the aspect of discipleship and personal evangelism seem to be kicking in. We used to do street preachings and street you know, sending out the pamphlets and things like that. But now, because of the issues that are emerging, there is more viability for personal interactions concerning faith. So I see that happening more and more as we move forward. One-on-one interactions, personal evangelism, and a quality discipleship time would happen in future. We've been missing, I guess, because of the organized church setups. Uh, just attending the church has become the normal way of life for Christian, but now that has disrupted, and you are looking at more. Uh, so other things that I feel would continue is definitely education through online. In India, only few pastors or few mega churches were present online before, but now everybody is online. So one problem that I see going forward is with the explosion of information on internet, people are exposed to everything. From good quality Bible expositions to heretical teaching. So there is a danger of being exposed to everything on the internet. So there's that danger we see, and maybe some young people might think, uh, especially there is this tendency I see that's growing among the young people, that they are now have the access to listen to Tony Evans or Dr. Charles Swindoll or the Giants. So they don't want to go to their normal church pastors who are residing. So things like that are happening. And with respect to college education, now we have access to Dr. Bock. See, now you are accessible to South African audience, even though you are in US with your Zoom. So I think it's going to change a lot, especially the way we are doing education and even the churches. Some of it I see as promising, but definitely it has its own challenges. But some of it I think is very good, in the sense of bringing people together, in the sense of reaching new people, in the sense of uh, accessing the best resources possible. So one issue that I always felt, even when I was in US, was I felt US had more resources in terms of people who are educated, or books, or things like that, educational institutions. But now with COVID, I feel most of the resources there are, if they are uh, things like lectures or faculty are available, so people can do online courses. So things like this seem to be very promising to me. Yeah, to cut down the story, I would say uh, it would be a mixture of challenges and also a lot of benefits I see going forward, Dr. Bob.
Well, I want to thank you all for kind of giving us a glimpse, 3 snapshots of what's going on in very different parts of the world, with some similarities and some differences in each case. So thank you, Neil, Michael, and Timothy, for for helping us understand how the pandemic is happening in different parts of the world. We really appreciate your willingness to be a part of the table today. And for those of you who are watching, we thank you for being a part of the table. We hope you'll join us again soon. And please subscribe to the table. If you're getting this, all you have to do is go back to where you got on, and you can subscribe to the table, and you'll automatically get this every week when we release on a Tuesday. So thank you for being with us, and we hope you'll join us again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.